Welcome to the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education Competition Subgroup podcast series. I'm Dr. Dan Manson, and I'm very excited today to have as my guest Dr. Claire LaFleur. And Claire is a postdoctoral research fellow with the U.S. Army Research Laboratory. Claire, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Dan. Thanks so much for having me.
So I got very excited about what you are doing with competitions. You are conducting research to explore the cognitive processes underlying effective cyber defense techniques. And for me, I've been hooked on competitions for the last 12 years. From the first time I saw one, I saw something you never see in the classroom. I saw a way for teams to work together under pressure in a real world environment. And for me, cybersecurity needs good research. It's desperate for research on the practical aspects of how do you do good cybersecurity, how do you work as a team in cybersecurity. So I really appreciate the work you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about how you became involved with research on cybersecurity teams and became involved with cyber competitions?
Absolutely. So my background is as a cognitive researcher and individual differences researcher. So I've always been interested in understanding how people develop cognitive abilities or skills across the lifespan. And when I entered the field of cybersecurity, there was this gaping hole in the research. How do these teams not only develop on an individual level to understand the skills and solve these open, complex problems, but also how do they learn how to work together and to know who's going to handle what area of work and who's going to handle if this sort of incident occurs. This is a really, really hard thing for people to learn how to do, and it's very specific and tailored to whatever task you're trying to do. And even though there's been so much awesome research done in cybersecurity, they haven't done a lot of research actually looking at defenders and attackers, the human beings behind the computers, that emphasize how hard the work they do is and how much training and development it takes. So it was just an obvious problem, something that hadn't really been covered in the research, and we saw an incredible opportunity with the cybersecurity events to sort of study that development across different groups. So
The ability to have an effective team, there's been a lot of research on that over the years. We see that in business, we see that in military, we see that in sports. How did you choose your first competition to do research on? What were you looking for?
great question. So we work in defensive cyber. So we wanted a situation where we were looking at teams who were trying to defend something only. A lot of the events in cybersecurity tend to focus on trying to attack something or attack and defend. And we wanted something that was going to be a little bit more ecologically valid to what we were trying to study, which is how groups of individuals defend a network against outcoming attackers. So the CCDC events are an incredible event for that because we have teams of 8 students working together. So we have that team level aspect. It is a defensive event. So teams are not trying to attack the red team or the other teams. They're just trying to maintain the services, respond to customer requests. Like I said, defend against the red team and just keep the company or the organization they're working for up and running. And one thing that's great about competitions overall is that you have these really strong outcome metrics. In the field, it's really hard to say whether or not someone's done a good job because they may have found some things in the network, but we can't call up China and say, hey, did we get all the malware you put in our systems? Did we knock out all the persistent attackers? So it's hard to say if someone's doing well, and the CCDC allows us to be able to say that at a team level, like this team did a great job in these different metrics. So that's what we were looking for, and the CCDC offered that for us.
My first cyber competition was the Midwest Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition in 2007. And I liked it so much, I led the creation of the Western Regional Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition in 2008, and I ran it for 10 years. And there's so many things I saw teams do right and teams do wrong. The first year in 2008, the Cal Poly team was convinced they were going to keep the red team out. They thought they had a way. They didn't realize it was more than keeping the red team out. So they wiped some of their systems, which meant they wiped the data that they needed for the injects and needed for the to be able to run the services. So the red team didn't get in the first day, but they hardly scored any points and they were in last place.
Of course.
So the competition, you're correct, it's a very rich environment. 2009, we had a team also from Cal Poly that finished first in the regional, finished fourth in the nationals, and then one of our sponsors, Boeing, wanted to interview the team. And I thought this was really cool. They didn't ask, who's your best player or who are your two best players? They said, we want to talk to your whole team. So I was able to observe the team interview. And at the end, they said, we want to hire your team to work together. So they obviously saw something in the team. In your research, what do you see that makes a team effective, and what do you see that hurts a team?
All right. So I can tell you a little bit about our research findings, and then I would like to add a couple of anecdotes of myself that I think sort of emphasize why it is important to look at teams and not just individuals like you were just describing. So our research shows that the type of communication strategy that teams have is important. We also find a lot of evidence that role specialization, or the way that team members assign roles to said team members, matters. So let me get a little bit into what I mean by those two things. So for face-to-face interaction, we have these sensors called sociometric badges. They're about the size of a credit card. You wear them around your neck, and they can get a signal from the infrared that sort of shapes like a cone. And when one person's cone overlaps with another one, then we can say that there's a signal between those two people, that somehow their bodies are aligned with one another, and the more overlap between each individual signal, the higher the likelihood that they are facing each other. So we took face-to-face data on these teams, and we were interested in saying, like, okay, teams who talk more, we assumed that they would do better. But in fact, we found the opposite, that teams that had less face-to-face interaction actually performed better. And that really surprised us. But it actually led to something that an anecdote has given me a lot of insight into. So I'm not going to name any names, because teams have told me their strategies on the assumption that I'm not going to share who's who. But what we've come to understand is that face-to-face conversation can be really valuable if you're exchanging information that's needed for everyone to get their jobs done. However, it can also be a distraction or a waste of somebody's time, or it may just be that nobody really knows what to do. So an example of a really high-performing team that I've worked with, they described how they had a structure of how team members would seek out help if they had a problem. So first of all, they have a book of sort of suggestions of things to do, and the team member can go through that before bringing anybody else in if they can't solve it based on their own knowledge. Then they go to the lead of their sub-team, so a Linux team or the firewall team, and they ask them for advice. And then at that point, if that person can't answer it, then it goes to the next level, and that's the team lead. And then they see if they have any idea of someone who might have expertise in that area who could help that person. And I think what this demonstrates is that they have a plan. They don't expect to just know everything and be able to do everything, but they have a plan for how to deal with that uncertainty of not knowing what to do without getting everybody pulled into it. So they're trying to maintain the functionality of the team members as much as possible, while also helping the student who is stuck to find a solution. And I think that's really effective for this team and for teams in general. You don't want to be spending your time having everybody in the team gathering together and trying to solve one problem, because you're supposed to all be doing multiple tasks. And if you're all trying to solve one problem, then all of the other work isn't getting done. So that lined up a lot with our findings. In addition, as I said, we found that individuals had different types of role compositions. So in our first study, we only had 8 teams. And what we found is that poor performing teams or less experienced teams, because they're very, very highly tuned to one another, high performing teams tend to be experienced teams. And in this case, we found that low-performing teams didn't really know what their roles were assigned to them, so they didn't really know if they had a firewall person or a person who's supposed to be handling IDS monitoring, someone who's the resident expert, etc. Whereas with high-performing teams, just about every single role that we listed was covered by multiple individuals. So every team had overlapping areas of skills when they're high performing. So that kind of shows the importance of that breadth and depth of knowledge, an ability to do multiple different tasks across multiple different people, but also have an in-depth understanding of how to do that task at a team level.
Did you find that the highly performing teams had experience playing together and had bonded over time? It would seem, based on what I've seen in CCDC, that the first time you play, it's really tough to know what you're doing.
Absolutely. So one of the things we found, not looking at the social aspect, is that teams that practiced with simulation style, so hands on keyboards trying to solve actual problems, performed much, much better. And we think that there is this kind of disconnect that lecture and workshops can be really great for knowledge elicitation, but to do cyber effectively, particularly as a team, you do need to sort of work together, have your hands on the keys, and actually be trying to do those tasks. On the social aspect, we found that teams that were highly collaborative were generally more successful across a wider range of outcome metrics, with the exception, I believe, of incident response, in which directive leadership was better. But generally, we find that this hands-on keyboard experience in training and a collaborative leadership style tends to be associated with higher performing teams. So I really do think it has a lot to do with having trust in the individuals, but then also having the experience of actually doing things. I mean, we were saying at RMCCDC this year, you can always tell the difference between a first-time team and a returning team, because they just understand better how things work and what's going to happen. And I think that's really great experience for them, because while the CCDC is not an exact replica of what they're going to do in the workplace, I think it's a lot closer and gives them a real experience of what their job workplace will be like.
I really believe competition stretch you in ways the classroom can't. I asked the captain for one of the teams that won, how much of what you learned in the classroom to get ready for winning this competition, and how much was outside the classroom? Without hesitation, he said 90% was outside the classroom. Have you researched on how teams develop their skills? What are the activities? How much is curricular? How much is extracurricular?
You know, that's a great question. I am actually exploring that right now. So we're looking at training schedules and how teams organize their training. So this time we asked, how many hours per week are you spending training? And when did you start training? Because what I'm interested in this case is, do teams who train fast and hard right before the event, do they do better than teams that have kind of been prepping for months at a slower rate? Do we see a difference in what kind of schedule is best for this? And we're also looking at proportions of time spent doing lecture style training, workshop training versus the simulation hands-on keyboard training again. And so far, my initial results suggest that, just like in our previous work, simulation is the best outcome.
Do you find that teams try to simulate being attacked? They try to simulate the red team, blue team game environment?
So absolutely. I know several teams who actually have relationships with professional cybersecurity individuals, and they actually will come in and red team for them. Alternatively, some of the more experienced team members will red team, and the new team members will have to respond to that. So they're definitely testing out the red team technique and sort of having things happen on the network. And again, it just shows that you really do need to have sort of a simulation style network that people would have access to, that they can kind of set up, maybe not even necessarily an automated attacker, but have everything else up and running so that students have the opportunity to sort of build these types of experiences.
What have you found regarding the role of a mixed team, the role that gender plays both to help a team in some of the pitfalls that teams fall into? Recently, the team that won the National Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition had a female captain. What have you found that are positive about your research, and what have you seen teams lacking that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, so right now I'm in the middle of looking at gender because I do think it's highly important to this field. You know, we have this huge talent gap, but we also have such a low proportion of women who are in this field. If we can convince women to come and succeed in cybersecurity, there's your talent gap right there. That's enough people to fill those positions if we got as many women as men interested in working in this field. And I have looked at gender in the most recent series of events. What I found is, let's say, a mixed bag. Right now, I don't necessarily know how to interpret it, so I want to follow up with students. But I have seen that women are overrepresented in leadership positions, policy documentation positions, and injects. This could be really great because those are core functions for the team, and they give women an opportunity for leadership. And research shows that women in cybersecurity who have had support and leadership training tend to perform better. So this could be really great that they're getting to do this. However, a lot of teams have an overall head and then a sub-area head. And sometimes those sub-area heads are spending more time actually doing the directive work, and the main person is functioning more as a negotiator or a motion regulator, and they're not really necessarily getting to do the hands-on assigning goals, but are doing more of the emotion control. And because women are being represented in policy documentation and leadership positions, they're underrepresented in areas like forensics. And additional work on data that we're collecting right now suggests that they're using less, or they're getting less practice on the applications than men are during the event. So they're using less programs during the event just about across the board. So they're getting less of that hands-on training that we found is so successful. So the third aspect is that women on these teams tend to have less experience than men. So that kind of leads to three potential outcomes, and it could be a little mix of all of them. One, it could be an incredible opportunity for women to be in leadership positions, something that will be incredibly useful for their future career. Two, they may be getting pushed into less technical positions and being responsible more for emotional management and sort of running jobs of going back and forth, filling out paperwork, and not getting the technical training that the men get. And then third, it's possible that they're in those roles not because of their gender, but because of the difference in experience level, that's what they're suited to. So right now, we have a really excellent researcher who's going to come in for the summer, and we're planning on reaching out to either do surveys or interviews to find out what the experience of the students, the female students on the teams actually has been, and sort of get a better handle on what these findings mean.
Excellent. When you look at how these students became interested in competitions, are you starting to see the players become involved at a younger age? Cyber Patriot's been around for about 10 years now. And I know some of the high schools and even middle schools that I've worked with, the kids get hooked on playing in competitions, both Cyber Patriot and Capture the Flags and other types. But they can start playing in middle school and really get excited in high school. So they actually come into college with several years of competition experience. Is that a measurement that you're starting to look at?
So that's a great question. We asked teams what their years of experience are, and it's not uncommon for people to say something like 5 or 6, which is impossible because all the team members on this have to be in college. So if they started in college, they can't have 5 or 6 years of experience. So yes, I think there definitely are signs that teams are starting to be involved in high school at least, and potentially also middle school in cybersecurity events, just based on the amount of experience they say they're coming in with.
Why do they like playing in competitions? What are some of the responses that you get?
So some people say it's because they want to know what the job is going to be like. Some of them just enjoy competition. For some of them, it's fun, and it's a great way to make learning more interesting and more valuable. These are really high-performing students that make it to these events. They're the best of the best. They work incredibly hard. I mean, I've been parsing the data, looking at how much time they spend preparing for these events, and half the time it's easily over 100 hours for this event. That's an incredible amount of dedication to something. So I think it goes beyond just liking being on a team. There is this desire for mastery in a lot of the students.
What about the employer side? I have all kinds of anecdotal stories on employers hiring students because of what they did in competitions, at least as much for that reason than whatever else they did in the classroom. But have you talked to employers about what they look for with students playing a competition, what they look for on the teams?
So that's a great question. I have not asked the employers directly, but it is actually something I'm really interested in exploring. One study that I'd really love to do is to follow several teams and potentially some cybersecurity students from the schools those teams are from, and see what the differences are between their trajectories. We've seen that there's a lot that students get from competing in the CCDC. Based on other people's research, I can say that students report realizing the importance of team dynamics and how important it is to sort of know how to work with one another better. They also say that it was a great opportunity to sort of experience uncertainty in a controlled environment. So the risks are letting their team down and not succeeding, but that's a much smaller risk than exposing a company and potentially losing your job. So this is a great way for them to know what the job market is like. And I think the companies looking at people who succeed in these competitions say, okay, not only are they intelligent in a collegiate environment, they have the potential to succeed in an actual office place because they are working as a team and they are using those skills and functioning in a way that is much more similar to what they would actually do in the workplace. So that would be my answer to that. I think that one of the things that I do have spoken to the employers with is working on students' soft skills as part of these events. Mm-hmm. It is not uncommon for students to have a lot of technical training, but less training or experience in presenting information to a non-technical group and sort of explaining the risks and benefits to that person. This is hugely important because a lot of what they're going to do, especially as they get higher up in their organization, is go and talk to people who are outside of their field and explain to them why that CEO needs to care about this new program that you want to bring in because it's going to help protect your system better. And Sorry, go ahead.
I think one of the myths about competitions, and especially the way people may look at a CCDC competition, is say, well, it's a technical competition.
No.
It's a way that you show off what you do at the keyboard, but it's much more than that. So what is it that how would you describe a competition in terms of the interplay between the technical and the soft skills?
Great question. So technical is definitely important. Of course, you do need to have some skills. However, you also need to think about, say, the organization of those skills, because you could have 10 people who are great at firewall, and you're not going to be able to defend anything because all you have is firewall. So you need to plan out in advance who's going to take on what roles and how they're going to be prepared to adapt to situations. So that takes a lot of individual management, and not only picking things that people can do well, but things that people are motivated to do well. For instance, I've heard several team members say, yeah, we have someone on the team who's really, really good at this, but they hate doing it and they just get frustrated. So they don't do that work anymore. And that takes soft skills to understand not only like, okay, we could slot this person into this role, but is this the best fit for them? Is this where they're going to succeed the most and be the most value to the team? That's one area. In addition, leadership is hugely important at these events, and keeping communication. It's not uncommon for teams to end up getting into arguments about the correct way to move forward. There needs to be a plan for that, and they need to sort of have a way of dealing with that. So that's hugely important to the success of the event, because, for example, one time I saw a team lead who decided to go off and spend 30 minutes in PowerShell during the beginning of the event because he thought it would be faster to do it through PowerShell than to do whatever the task was they were doing through the GUI that the other team members wanted to use. And he managed to do it in PowerShell, which is great, but for 30 minutes, the firewall guy had to step up and be in charge of the team because the team lead decided to go off and do this other task. And that's a problem. You do need to be prepared for what it means to be a team lead and to have people in the right positions.
So I like the analogies to sports. I know we can call those that want to go into cyber warriors or athletes, but I lean toward the athlete. And that's a common problem in sport, the ego, the player that wants to take all the shots, the player that doesn't want to pass the ball, the player that wants to show off their own game at the expense of the team. Are there other analogies that you see to a good sports team in CCDC?
Well, I'll start by saying that I am not necessarily the most up-to-date on sports, so I'm going to go with some general things about teaming that I think would be really relevant. So I think that this is not if we think of cybersecurity as a sport, it's not a sport where you can have one amazing team member who can carry the rest of the team. Everybody needs to be working together. You need to have successful defensive and offensive groupings. Even in this situation where you're doing predominantly defensive work, you do need to have somebody who's doing offensive work in the sense of writing up incidents reports and responding to attacks. One thing that we see very commonly is that teams will end up getting too focused on running down red team and locking them out, and will stop doing their other work. So a good balance between defense and offense is hugely important, especially leaning towards more defense than offense. We see the important role of strategy, and one thing that I've seen in sports is that you'll have teams that are doing amazing at the beginning and they lose their wind. They start underperforming near the end. That's something we're actually interested in exploring with this data collection is there a trajectory? Do teams who tend to perform well hold steady, say with injects? Are they getting every inject, or are they doing particularly well at the beginning? Or are they perhaps underperforming at the beginning because they're focusing on hardening their network, but then their systems stay up and they're getting the benefits of not only being able to complete injects, but also to be able to keep their services up and running?
One difference between playing CCDC and playing a traditional sport may have a 45-minute time in the game or a couple of hours in the game, but CCDC is a couple of days. One area that is very interesting to me, and it's a person that isn't supposed to play much of a role, at least in CCDC, and that's the coach.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't really have the coach call timeout and gather the team together in the middle of the game. But in your research, have you looked at the role of a coach?
That's really interesting. I have not looked at it specifically. It is a great area to study, and I do have some anecdotal notes. So some of the highest performing teams I have seen, they may have engaged mentors or they may not, but it's always a team-driven event. So what I mean by that is that, take UVA. Two of the students basically recreated the group and decided, we want to have this team. We want to be able to do this. And in a couple of months, got together and were able to go to the first event they'd been to in a while, if they'd even been before, and managed to win nationals that year. And there was this very intense emphasis and motivation on the part of the students to succeed. There is variability in team leads, the academic advisors, and how involved they are. Some of them are sort of just there as chaperones. Some of them are extremely involved. I would say that an example is the UMBC lead. He seems to be very highly involved with his team members. True of Liberty as well. That's just the last event I went to, so that's why I'm remembering the teams that were at MACCDC right now. And versus other situations where like I said, the team captain is really just there as a chaperone. And it would be interesting to see how important that role is and whether or not it's predominantly student-driven or predominantly leader-driven is representative of how teams score, or even how teams are composed.
What are some of the ways that you've disseminated your research so that those listening to the podcast, if they want to know more about what you've done, they can find a publication or find a posting, a blog? Where have you been able to show your research?
So one of the things that we really believe in is that you should treat the students who come to these events as an expert population. They're doing us a favor by allowing us to do research, and we want to be able to help them in return. So we try to disseminate our results back to the leaders of the events so that they can pass it down to the students, and those students have the opportunity to learn more about what's actually being done. In addition, for people who are interested in our research, you can find copies of our papers at ResearchGate, and then I also post additional papers, or let's say figures that I haven't had a chance yet to publish but are really exciting and that I'd like people's thoughts on. So I definitely will post some new stuff from this data collect as soon as I have things that I think are reliable and robust.
What are some of the research areas you would like to do in the future? What are the topics you really would like to delve into?
Great question. So one of the things that I would really love to be able to do is look more closely at the workflows, what students are doing. For instance, I would be really interested in seeing application monitoring. So during an event, someone says they're this role on the team. Are they using the same tools at the same times as people on different teams? Can we predict the performance of teams based on what kind of programs they're using and when they're using it, how much time they're spending using programs associated with, say, detection versus defense? And can we extract that information? We've developed a tool to do that, but we haven't been able to use one at one of these events yet. In addition, I'm really interested in looking at longitudinal outcomes of students in these events. I think it could be really, really valuable to see where students end up and get their thoughts 1, 2, maybe even 5 years out and say, hey, did CCDC do something for you that you wouldn't have gotten in a different way? And are there things you would suggest changing about the CCDC to more line up with your experience in the field?
So let me ask you a question about capturing the data.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to watch a game, or if I'm going to watch a military team, I get to watch the team.
Yes.
And you can watch it over time. You can have someone explain what was going on. But we don't really have that yet, that I've seen, where you can look at it as plays that have been executed by the team and be able to dissect the play and look at what they did right, what they didn't do right.
Yeah, we would really like to develop something like that. We're actually working that from 2 different angles in our own lab, the Chimera Lab, located at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. So we're trying to build a simulation lab that will allow the development of scenarios for both an individual and a team level group to sort of go through a network that we would design with some vulnerability issues and potentially bring some red team members or even orange team members into play on the environment. And what we think would be the best way to sort of get that information so that you could have that sort of after action review, this worked, this didn't, is twofold. First, by having a set of validated observer metrics that can tell you something about what the team is doing and what is working and what is not working. And we're working with Robert Hoffman from IHMC to better develop those techniques. And then we're also working with Lockheed Martin to collect sensor data from stuff like keyloggers and screen caps, and like I was saying, application monitors, to sort of see what's happening between the human and the computer. And we'd like to be able to bring those pieces of information together along with information about how the event is going along to say, okay, so these are how these teams responded to this. This is what observers saw, what worked and what didn't. But that kind of research takes time. And, we're hoping to be able to actually bring some of the students into our laboratory to help us develop those techniques. So
very cool.
I'll have to check back in a year.
What are some of the outcomes you really want from your research?
I would like to have a better fine-grained understanding of these team level processes. So like you were kind of describing with the plays, I would really like to be kind of able to see the interchange between team members happening over time and how they're responding to things happening in their network. We have a really talented sociologist on our team, Ben Gibson, who is working on developing a modeling technique called a relational events framework that he uses to sort of see how things change in a social network after a event occurs. And we're really hoping that he'll be able to use that to sort of help us see what changes happen in a social network in terms of what they're doing, how they're communicating with one another, and to be able to use that information to generate a form factor that tells us something about what that team is doing that is highly relevant to their performance. So that would be the thing I would like to see most. And then second off is see the long-term outcomes of attending the CCDC events, just to be able to show, because anecdotally we know they're really valuable, but I'd like to kind of see, is there something we're missing that we could add to the event? And is there stuff we don't even realize that we're providing them? Because then we can help build that and make it an even more valuable experience for students.
Claire, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I'm very excited about the research that you're doing and where you can go with it. Please stay in touch with us and please keep going. It's so needed in our field.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's been a pleasure getting to speak with you today. And yes, I can't wait. As soon as I have good findings or reliable findings, I will pass them back to you all.
Thank you. This has been the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education Competition Subgroup podcast.